A handful of blocks northwest of the Hotel del Coronado is the Coronado Historical Association. The entrance says Museum of History and Art, and the banner hanging above says Open Doors at the top. The Vietnam War was fought between North and South Vietnam from 1955 to 1975. Communist powers of China and the Soviet Union supported the North, while the United States and other allies fought alongside the South. It was a long, brutal, and controversial war, with hundreds of American POWs ending up in North Vietnamese prisons, thousands that were listed as missing in action, and over 58,000 that gave their lives. The exhibit is called Open Doors Vietnam POWs and features a drawing by Captain Mike McGrath. He says, "If I were to have one open door in my prison experience, it would be the door for my cell." The focus is on the struggle and hardships of the prisoners as well as the lives they lived after the Vietnam War. We will share a few of their stories and have a look into the details of their captivity. These accounts were recorded for the 30th anniversary of their release 20 years ago. Some of them have passed on, but their stories and narratives remain. At the front of the exhibit are the uniforms worn by the POWs imprisoned across North Vietnam. The prisons were given nicknames by the American service members, like Briar Patch, Alcatraz, Dirty Bird, Zoo, and the Hanoi Hilton. These sandals are made from tires and were standard issue. Like all clothing for the POWs, they were one size fits all. A Mephisto razor blade in its packaging shows how the POWs were required to shave once per week. One blade and handle were shared by all and taken away after. This painting shows two F-4E Phantom IIs flying high in the clouds. There's also a model of an A-4 Skyhawk and another model F-4 Phantom II. Both planes were flown in the Vietnam War. If you'd like to hear more about these planes and others, search for and watch the San Diego Review on the Air and Space Museum after this one. Here are Vietnamese currency and product labels. On the right are bars of soap, which were issued to each POW when the Vietnam War ended. Upon initial interrogation, each prisoner was logged in as a smoker or non-smoker. Those who did must have had access to them, as these empty Vietnamese cigarette packs came from POWs in Cu Loc prison. This poster grabs people's attention with the title "Ignore Him" and a POW sitting in a cell. Its intention was to have the American public write letters of appeal to North Vietnam to follow the Geneva Conventions of humanitarian treatment of POWs in captivity. Colonel Ben M. Pollard suffered a broken back and severe internal bleeding from his waist to his knees when he was shot down in Vietnam. He spent 6 years in captivity. When the pain became too much and he couldn't get himself off the floor, another POW, Captain Mel Moore, simply said to him, "Listen, you walk or you die." With Moore's help and 6 months of physical therapy, he did walk. After being freed from his prison and returned to the United States, Colonel Ben Pollard flew planes again. He was medically grounded from flying jets, but became a pilot and instructor of glider aircraft. He prefers the quiet solitude of soaring in the sky and appreciates climbing higher without an engine. Pollard says, "Birds do the same thing we do. So if you see a hawk or an eagle soaring in a circle, hey, you go right over there and sure enough you'll find out that there's lift." One day when I was flying, I looked up and saw this eagle, and I went up and got on the lift he was in. We were going up right with him. The majority of POWs were pilots trained to fly jet-powered machines like this Phantom II. Let's take a minute to imagine what flying may be like, at least from the perspective of a glider. Unlike a bird, a glider cannot flap its wings to fly higher. They must be on the lookout for heated air rising upwards, otherwise known as thermals. Where do these thermals form, and how are they created? A cumulus cloud that has a flat base with a well-defined sharp form usually means there's a good chance of finding a thermal underneath. A dissipating cumulus means that the thermal is past its prime. The air around is cooling, and along with it, the thermal. A circling bird or glint from another glider's wing within a thermal gives a pilot a physical signal that a thermal is present. Sun-facing slopes that are higher and drier on a hill or mountainside have a better chance of heating up and transferring that heat upwards as a thermal. Areas on the ground with lush green vegetation and shadows from trees will use the sun's rays to evaporate moisture. A better location to encounter a thermal would be over a dry yellowish field that is exposed to the sun. After being launched, a glider can use thermals to remain aloft for several hours and travel hundreds of miles without having to land. The Torrey Pines glider port was used to launch gliders and now serves as a takeoff and landing area for hang gliders and paragliders. If you'd like to learn more about these unpowered forms of flight, search for and watch the San Diego Review on Torrey Pines after this one. Commander Everett Alvarez Jr. was the first U.S. pilot shot down in the Vietnam War, and one of the first POWs to be captured. He was held captive for 8 years, 7 months. His quiet demeanor and ability to compartmentalize allowed him to survive through the isolation, torture, and starvation. The fact that he withstood so much for so long stopped his other cellmates from feeling sorry for themselves, and their will to persevere was strengthened. On the 50th anniversary after being released with other POWs in 1973, Alvarez spoke aboard the USS Midway here in San Diego on March 29, 2023, commemorating those who served and sacrificed their lives during the Vietnam War. We can only imagine being shackled, imprisoned, and isolated would lead one to contemplate their life and lifespan. A search of animals' lifespans yields this chart. As we look down the list, humans are recorded with a lifespan just around 79 years. We can think of it, more or less, equivalent to around 28,000 days. Each day, a typical person wakes, eats, goes to work, has a few hours for leisure or exercise, and then goes to sleep. This cycle repeats over and over again for the majority of our lives. Of course, we are not imprisoned as the POWs were. However, we humans are habitual by nature. Have you ever stopped to think about how these habits affect our sense of time? Time seems to pass faster with every year we have existed on the planet. When in elementary school, each year seems like a decade. In high school or college, time gets compressed with seemingly less time as the years go by faster. When we enter the workforce, years or decades can pass without us noticing their progression. Stop and think about how many of those 28,000 days you have already lived. Reflect on how you've used them. Are there things you would like to have accomplished? Where are the places or sights you want to see? Do you feel there is something you must contribute to the world? Is there a creative spark within you or an innovation that needs to be expressed or realized? Here is former POW Vice Admiral James Stockdale explaining how organizing a routine helped him to cope with isolation.
It became obvious after a while of living alone that if you didn't want to become an animal, you had to organize your life in some way. Now, this may seem like a strange thing to be in a little bit of a box in a pair of leg irons and to organize one's life, but I learned to do push-ups and leg irons. These were traveling. I did exercises, and of course I had a ritualistic period in the day when I prayed.
Here is Ed Hubbard showing the leg irons and cell he was in. Having a structured routine helped POWs occupy their minds while in solitary confinement. Everett Alvarez spent more than 3,100 days in captivity. That's more than 10% of the average person's life. We are grateful for the sacrifices made by military service members to give us the freedom to pursue our dreams. Always remember to appreciate the privileges we have and spend your time wisely by doing what is truly important to you during the days you have lived and the days you have left to live. Here are regulations from the prison called Zoo upon the end of the war. Although North Vietnam regarded U.S. service members as war criminals, the regulations slowly came closer to those outlined in the 1949 Geneva Conventions. Conditions noticeably improved with the death of North Vietnam's President Ho Chi Minh in September 1969. An artistic rendering of the United States flag is on display. It is made out of barbed wire with a silhouette of a bowed head in front of a guard tower, honoring the image on the POW MIA flag as seen on this banner in the adjacent room of the exhibit. Once released in 1973, Lieutenant Commander Ralph Gaither wrote this prayer and letter of appreciation. The last of the POWs would be released by March 29, 1973. Some, like Gaither, revisited their ordeal, publishing books of their imprisonment. Have you seen this man? Perhaps riding his bike around Ocean Beach? He has a memorable story. Douglas B. Hegdahl wasn't shot down in a plane like many other POWs. He went through boot camp here in San Diego and served on the USS Canberra, which also homeported in San Diego. He grew up in the farming region of South Dakota and was excited to see the world. When the USS Canberra began its bombardment of North Vietnam in the Gulf of Tonkin, he locked all his valuables in his locker and went out on deck. Here's the beginning of Douglas Hegdahl's story as told by Joe Krecka.
Douglas Hegdahl, who was aboard the USS Canberra, a guided missile cruiser that had 8-inch guns. And they were going to use the 8-inch guns to try to hit this bridge that we'd lost a lot of airplanes and pilots on, the Than Hoa, also called the Dragon's Jaw Bridge. And he's 19, he's only a seaman apprentice. He's up there, he knows that they're going to fire the guns at dark 30 in the morning, and he wants to see the flash and hear the bang, and he's leaning over the rail and the guns go boom and the ship goes sideways. He stays right where he is and into the water. And this is in the South China Sea at, 3 in the morning or something like that. And he doesn't even know which way is up, and he hears all this gurgling noises and he hears the screws going by, and they miss him, and he pops to the surface, and it's complete dark and complete silence on the South China Sea. And I didn't think about it at the time, anyway. Otherwise I'd have said, what do you mean complete silence? I thought they were firing the 8-inch guns. And then I figured it out. Somebody saw him go overboard, and they said, okay, you can quit shooting now, Hegdahl's overboard.
He was without a life preserver and did as he was taught, using his dungarees as a makeshift float, tying off the cuffs, filling it with air, and wrapping it around his neck. It didn't work as well as he had hoped, and tried floating on his back. He figured the USS Canberra wouldn't locate him in the dark. He was told that drowning was a nice way to die, and put his hands over his head and forced himself below the surface. Everyone has heard that your life flashes before your eyes. You see a white light, and all the best memories come rushing in your mind all at once. Well, Douglas Hegdahl could tell you himself that doesn't happen. No visual montage of happy moments, no hauntingly beautiful music played by angels with harps, no brilliant heavenly light warming your soul. only the freezing cold water of the Gulf of Tonkin and the pitch blackness of night. When dawn arrived in the east, Hegdal started swimming away from the sun in sporadic intervals, turning on his back and resting in between. He could see the slight haze of land on the western horizon, but the harder he tried, the further back the land receded. He kept trying and trying. Slowly the sun moved across the sky and toward the mainland he so desperately was attempting to reach. He had already been in the water half a day, and it didn't seem the Canberra would turn around anytime soon. At this point, most people might have given in and succumbed to the water and waves. Hegdal would not give up. He kept swimming and periodically would turn face up, humming a few tunes or saying a few prayers. About 6 in the evening, his prayers were answered, but not exactly the way he wanted. A Vietnamese fishing boat found him and hauled him out of the water. He was then turned over to the Vietnamese militia and taken to the Hoa Lo prison, meaning fiery furnace, or the Hanoi Hilton as it was called by Americans. North Vietnam had 13 prisons and prison camps, with the Hanoi Hilton being the most widely known. Despite its nickname given by the US military, it was quite the opposite. This drawing is by Captain Mike McGrath, showing how prisoners had leg irons around their ankles to keep them from moving away from their bed. Another shows how the POWs were tied to a stool and not allowed to rest or sleep for 15 to 20 days. McGrath called this one the Vietnamese rope trick, tying the wrists behind a POW's back and rotating the arms forward up over their head. When Douglas Hegdal arrived, his captors knew he didn't have the look of a pilot and were wondering who he was. Remember now, he had put everything back in his locker on the USS Canberra. He didn't even have his eyeglasses to see far distances. They showed him piles of materials supposedly written by what the North Vietnamese called Yankee air pirates, giving up more information than just name, rank, serial number, and date of birth. Hegdal realized these officers were gauging him for usefulness and information gathering, whether through interrogation or torture. He decided his best option was to pretend to be stupid. He talked about the farms of South Dakota in comparison to those of North Vietnam. He also mentioned his family had no water buffalo. To the North Vietnamese officers, no water buffalo meant Hegdal was a poor peasant. Doug caught on to this and figured it would be to his advantage to play the role of a simple-minded poor peasant from then on. They grew tired of verbal questioning and told him he would need to write an anti-war statement for them. Hegdal happily agreed. The interrogators were surprised, as this was the first time a prisoner agreed to do anything without being tortured first. They brought out the paper, ink, and pens. He appreciated the gesture and said, "But one small thing. I can't read or write. I'm a poor peasant." To the Vietnamese, this was believable since their poor peasants couldn't read or write either. They assigned someone to teach him to write, spell, and use grammar and sentence structure. It was to no avail, as Hegdal kept up his act of ignorance, unable to comprehend what they wanted of him or retain any information of significance. They finally gave up and wrote for him a letter of confession, saying he committed the war crime of shelling the birthplace of Vietnamese President Ho Chi Minh and had him sign it with an unintelligible scrawl. The North Vietnamese were not sure how Hegdal would fit into their propaganda plans, and he was moved around the prison, eventually being paired up for a while with Lieutenant Joe Krecka. Here's his account of how he was shot down over Vietnam.
The missile that hit us is called an SA-2. NATO term for it is called Guideline. It's designed to knock down a B-52. At launch, it's 35 feet long. It's this big around. It's a giant shotgun shell designed to knock down a B-52. And here it hit this 58-foot long fighter. All right, so what do you think happened to the fighter? It obliterated it. I look over the left and right side of my front seater's shoulders and look into the front seat to see all the bad lights are on. Fire and overheat left, fire and overheat right. All the bad lights on the tail light panel next to his right knee. I know it's all over. I look in the rear view mirrors, orange flames and black smoke as far as I can see. He yells, "Get out." My front seater was Gordon Scott Wilson, 1962 Air Force Academy grad. He was from Hobart, Indiana. Best stick in the squadron, except maybe me. Get out. And just like that, boom, he's gone. I rotate, look up like that, and I'm thinking, you silly so-and-so, he's going that way at 600 miles an hour, you know. So it's get out, holy crap, boom, and I'm out. And as soon as my big chute opened, I looked around for to get my bearings, and I could see the airplane had already hit. There was black smoke coming up from a hole in the ground. And at 1,500 feet, this black shape that I see on the ground, I didn't know what it was, but it's changing shape. And I realized it's a horde of people. I would say about 300 people. And that's when I realized I'm going to be captured as soon as I hit the ground. I get down to 150 feet, and there's this one guy down there on the ground. I was probably about 300 feet, and he's going like this to me, because I'm heading right towards him, just like you're supposed to do in a parachute landing fall. And he's telling me to go like this, you know, and I look at the horizon like Oliver Hardy would look at the camera when Stan Laurel was doing something stupid, which was always, you know, and I went, like, what am I supposed to do with this guy? He's a dunce, you know. So I gave him an uncomplimentary hand signal, accompanied with some suitable verbiage, and told him to get the hell out of the way. And he did. He got out of the way, and it went to crash into this, I think it was a potato patch. And then I was surrounded by about 300 Vietnamese, mostly villagers, some militia because they had rifles, and they were hitting me all over and beating me up. And then the next thing is they were cutting everything off of me, my flight suit, my anti-G suit, my vest and everything. And then a little while later they threw me in a truck and took me to Hanoi for the interrogation.
Kricka had been in solitary confinement before meeting Hegdahl. He coped with isolation through exercising his brain by memorizing lists like presidents' names and states.
I was in solitary for 8 months, 228 days, before I had one roommate, and he was, of all things, a Navy seaman apprentice. And how does a Navy seaman apprentice get into the Hanoi Hilton? He is Douglas Hegdahl. He has a very good sense of humor. He says, "I'm not like you guys flying the fast airplanes," he said. He says, "I had the lowest, slowest ejection of the entire war." And he says, "I didn't get captured, I got rescued." And I taught him 242 names, and he got released early, and he brought home 272 names. And he brought home a lot of information that the U.S. government didn't have. He was the only one of the 12 that came home early that he came home without any stigma attached to it.
POWs were allowed to receive or send letters a few times a year, if at all. The text would be examined closely, and some POWs were forced to write letters approving the living conditions or denouncing the U.S. government. Here's the flight log of James Stockdale from September 1965. On the 9th day, it shows he was flying an A4E Skyhawk, and on the far right, the word eject in red, the day his plane was shot down over Vietnam. From 1970 to 1973, POW MIA bracelets were worn to raise awareness of service members that were captured or still missing. They had name, rank, and lost date engraved. Proceeds went towards supporting POWs and their families, as well as efforts for their release and return. Sybil Stockdale and a group of POW MIA wives in Coronado started an organization to raise awareness of the harsh treatment of POWs and to repatriate remains of service members who had lost their lives in the Vietnam War. This organization eventually formed into the National League of POW MIA Families. These papers show how Sybil Stockdale practiced sending coded messages to her husband imprisoned in Vietnam. The correspondence contained important information for the CIA and naval intelligence. Shortly after meeting Joe Krecka, Douglas Hegdahl was moved to another cell, this time with Lieutenant Commander Richard Beak Stratton. Here's Stratton recalling his meeting with Hegdahl.
This moose, and I taught you, this guy was big. The guy was bigger than I am. He was taller than I am, and he was healthier than I was. And my name is Seaman Apprentice Douglas Hegdahl. What's yours, sir? Always remember those words. And I'm looking at it like, I can't believe this. What set him apart, first of all, was that he was taking it, which it was for him, as a great adventure. Well, he's 19 years old. Vietnamese would sleep for 2 hours in the afternoon to make the revolution go quicker, I guess. And it was good because that's when you would communicate and this and that. But I was in isolation. I didn't have people to communicate with. So I'd lay down, try and get some rest too. I'm laying down, and this guy is skipping around the center, a very small room, about this big, but he's skipping around the center between the two pads. Doug, what you doing? And he stops, looks at me, and he says, skipping, sir. I could see that. He said, Doug, what you doing that for? He looks at me and stops, says, you got anything better to do, sir? Skip. I didn't have anything better to do. And we picked up a piece of brick. We used that for chalk right on the floor. No paper, no pencils, no nothing. So we're sitting there and we're getting a little bit bored. And he says, Dick, you know the Gettysburg Address? Well, my God, I got 2 college degrees and all that kind of stuff. We ought to be able to figure that out. So you can regenerate. It's amazing what you can regenerate when you're in solitary and isolation, which is a whole other story. But we got it down pretty good. We got it, and it was race here and got it accurate. And we're looking at it and admiring our work. And he said, Dick, can you say the Gettysburg Address backwards? And of course, this is why I'm done. I think, have I got a mental giant here, or have I got a savant of some kind? And I'm saying, who the hell would want to know how to say the Gettysburg Address backwards? Even Lincoln wouldn't want that. And I said, no, Doug, I don't. And he says, well, I do. I said, I don't believe it. He says, I'll do it. I said, you track me on that. And so I'm tracking him, and by God, there he's saying the damn thing backwards, not missing a word. And I'm saying, I got a savant. He's not stupid. I got myself a savant. He got those names. Yeah, he remembered a great, almost photographic memory. I said, this guy is a gold mine, because we got to get all the intelligence dumped into him, because if he's going to get sent home, we want him to go out as best we can get him. But as an aside, the last time we saw Doug, Alice and I, was in 2010. We had gone to do our physicals down at Pensacola, and he went with us on that. Driving along, Alice remarked to him and said, Dick always uses that story about the Gettysburg Address, as an example of your steel trap mind and all that. And Doug's sitting there and he's laughing. And I'm saying, what the hell are you laughing about? He says, I can't say it backwards. Who the hell would want to say it backwards? And I said, yeah, that was precisely my thought. I says, I heard you. I say it back. He says, I can't. He says, think about it. You're reading it, tracking me. I'm standing behind you. I'm reading it off the thing. You stupid officers, you never get the word.
Joe Krecka had trained Douglas Hegdahl, and his sharp memory would be able to deliver information to the United States. Stratton was Hegdahl's direct superior, and was fully in favor of preparing him with as much knowledge as possible. All that was needed was a way to get him out of prison and back to America. Early releases from captivity were looked down upon by the POWs. First, those involved were deserting their fellow servicemen, leaving them behind. Second, they were providing the enemy with something they wanted in exchange for their release. The Vietnamese soldiers would find out who could be used as propaganda by seeing how badly each POW wanted to return home. They asked Hegdahl the leading question: "What do you want more than anything else in the world?" A weak and willing answer would be, "To go home to my family." Continuing his role, Douglas Hegdahl answered, "Why, I'd like a pillow, sir." This was a reasonable request, since their cement pads or bedboards had no pillow, but it dumbfounded the enemy. The guards and interrogators eventually began calling him the incredibly stupid one. His act was paying off, and as they thought of him as stupid, they would let him enter the cell block courtyard during the siesta to sweep up the grounds, monitored by only one sleepy guard. Doug would be sweeping and humming until the guard was asleep. Then he would back up to a truck, spin the gas cap off its pipe, crouch down, putting a small amount of dirt in the gas tank, then replace the cap. Stratton later recalled observing Hegdahl do this to 5 trucks over a period of time. Each one of those trucks was towed away for repair. According to Stratton, Hegdahl was only one of 2 men that was able to destroy military equipment while a prisoner of war. The Hua Lo prison of today is a tourist attraction, but back then, Hegdahl had a view of different cell blocks from the courtyard. This view, however, was blurred since he left his eyeglasses on the USS Canberra prior to the bombardment that knocked him overboard. He had an idea to fix this and went to the authorities asking to read some of their propaganda. They were thrilled to have a prisoner volunteering to read their materials without being tortured first. Doug said, "Small thing, I can't read without glasses." They searched for a dime store clerk who fitted him with pair after pair of eyeglasses so he could read. Hegdahl's reading vision was fine. Unbeknownst to the clerk, he actually picked out glasses that would correct his distance vision. Now he could relay communications between cell blocks not only by sweeping out codes with his broom, but also by hand signals that could be seen across the courtyard. On the subject of codes, the TAP code was a major form of communication between prisoners. It was brought over and taught by Colonel Carlisle Smitty Harris.
Part of our training in fighters was to go through a survival training program. And while I was there, I was in a class and a master sergeant happened to be the instructor. And he was explaining how in World War II, prisoners held by the Germans were able to communicate between 2 buildings by tapping on a water pipe. And as I was walking out of the class, the instructor was just beside me, and I said, "How did they send the dashes?" And he said, "Oh, I should explain. It was not the Morse code. It was a tap code. They were not teaching it as part of the program, but I just happened by chance to learn it from this instructor." So after I was shot down in North Vietnam, I was one of the very early shoot downs, and I was able to communicate that tap code to some other POWs. As we were moved from into other camps away from Hanoi, always someone took a tap code with them and was able to pass it on. So no matter where you went in the POW system in North Vietnam, if you heard this, the guy on the other side of the wall would, and you started the communication process.
The 1973 summer edition of Coronado's Bridge and Bay magazine welcomed home 5 of their POWs. During the time they were imprisoned, America had landed on the moon, and construction of the Coronado Bay Bridge was started and completed. After the return of the POWs, their input was included in the Navy's research manual on recovering air crewmen under combat conditions. This scrapbook shows an invitation to the White House for a welcome home dinner in May 1973 for the POWs. This ashtray was one of the gifts they received, in addition to cufflinks and other items. The medals on display are military awards and decorations of Vice Admiral James Stockdale, including a Medal of Honor for distinguished leadership of his fellow POWs after almost 8 years in captivity. There is also a christening bottle for the USS Stockdale, a guided missile destroyer commissioned in 2008. When entering prison, each POW is issued a wool blanket, a mosquito net, and a cup. The cup in the center has Tony scratched at the top. Lieutenant Colonel Tony Marshall later had it engraved with more information. On the right is the actual cup of James Stockdale, who will also use it in this video to demonstrate the tap code in a few minutes. Morse code uses both long and short signals for each letter. Here is Commander Jeremiah Denton on how he used Morse code.
Having tortured me for my confession, they were going to hope they could carry over to an interview in which I would say the words they wanted me to say. But I decided I'd just say the opposite of what they briefed me on. Saw the lights, the TV cameras, and decided I'd blink my eyes in Morse code and spell out the word torture over and over again. In case they fitted words into my mouth that were apologetic on my part. In other words, faked it. I would at least let them know I'd been tortured by T-O-R-T-U-R-E.
You can see the long and short signals by focusing on the duration his eyes are closed. Unlike Morse code, the tap code is strictly short taps. How are letters of the alphabet distinguished from one another? The tap code arranges the letters into a 5x5 box, in order, with the letter K being the same as the letter C. The grid is navigated by tapping coordinates of the row and column of each letter with a pause in between. For example, here's Vice Admiral James Stockdale describing how the tap code was initiated and communicated.
To get practical about it, we had to have a call-up. We soon learned that the best way to call up an American was to give him a very traditional American signal, which is the shave and the haircut. What do you do when you hear that? You rush the wall and you go, 2 bits. So that was natural. So if I were going to talk to the guy at the other end of the building, I could probably raise him by a big thump with the heel of my hand. And if he was alert and it was during a quiet period, I would hear back. If, on the other hand, I had access to the peephole, I could see the shadow under the door, I knew where the guard was, and I wanted to talk surreptitiously and rapidly to the man next door, I might have the convention of using the cup even for that, because we could tap. And then I'd get it back. You know what I just sent him? Hi, H-I. And then he would give, and then I would say, R, the letter R, U, okay.
The North Vietnamese periodically selected a group of 3 POWs to be released early and used as propaganda for their own objectives. As they saw Hegdahl as incompetent, they figured he would be a harmless choice for early release. Hegdahl did not want to go, because like many POWs, he knew it was not honorable to leave his fellow servicemen behind, and he did not want to give the enemy an opportunity to use him to serve their wishes. Stratton knew the importance of the list of names Hegdahl memorized, and as his direct superior, he ordered Doug to accept the early release to deliver the vital information back to the US government. When Douglas B. Hegdahl was released, he relayed the list of over 270 prisoners of war that were thought to be missing in action. Here's a clip of him in his own words.
3 of us that came back, we changed the status of 40 people from missing to prisoner of war. I accumulated this list of names from one of my cellmates, early cellmates, Joe Krecka, and we put them in alphabetical order, rank and then alphabetical order, starting in the Air Force, since he was Air Force. We made a jingle out of it, and it went like this. Lieutenant Colonels, Crow Jim Hughes, Jen Lamar, Gordon Larson, Robbie Reisner Strickland, Majors, Emil Baker, Hal Bernstrom, Jack Bomar, Dick Bissett, Don Burns, Ron Burns, Art Burrell, Fred Cherry, Will Gideon, Larry Gaynor, Jim Highshaw, Ken Hughes, Sam Johnson, Lou Mikowski, Romero, Al Runyon, so forth, right through the list.
When I got back, I was telling my debriefer, and he says, "Can you slow it down?" I said, "No, it's like riding a bicycle. You tip over,
The information he provided the United States would not have been received until the end of the war 5 years later. Of the 12 POWs who accepted early release from the Hua Lao prison, Hegdahl is the only one who did it under orders, and as a result, he is still respected by the other POWs for not cooperating with the enemy. Douglas B. Hegdahl went on to serve as a survival school instructor for the U.S. Navy at the Survival, Evasion, Resistance, and Escape Center on Naval Air Station North Island in Coronado. He's somewhat of a mysterious legend, reportedly living in Ocean Beach and riding his bicycle up to 6 hours a day. But that was 20 years ago, when the Open Doors exhibit debuted. He would be 76 years old by now, and Douglas Hegdahl did leave a quote that may hint of his whereabouts. Well, I was thinking about getting one of those bicycle taxis, you know? Pedal people around and make money. I'd also like to visit Australia. I missed that part of the sea tour on the USS Canberra when I fell overboard. 1 block from the Coronado Historical Association is Star Park, which honors our military and has the POW MIA flag just beneath the American flag. There's a gun donated by Major General Joseph H. Pendleton, and a grape shooter also donated by Camp Pendleton's namesake. This 5-point star at the base of the flagpole has the U.S. Navy, Marine Corps, Army, Coast Guard, and Air Force. As a side note, right here at 1101 Star Park Circle is the house where the author of The Wizard of Oz would live when he visited Coronado. If you come to see it, please respect the privacy of the owners. As for any overseas POWs, there's no place like home. If you enjoyed this video, you can help this channel grow for free. Please click like, share this video with family and friends, and most important of all, click subscribe. Thanks for watching San Diego Review.